All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Um, Welcome today. Thank you, first off, for taking time out of your busy days to join us today to do a workshop on our draft data guidelines that we, as the Office of Energy Infrastructure Safety, are going to be presenting on today. Uh, my name is Stephen Lai. I am the manager over the Data Analytics Division for Energy Safety, and I'll be joined today by a host of other energy safety staff to cover the data guidelines that we have. If we go to the next slide, please. As you can see today, this is our agenda. We're going to do kind of a quick introduction, meeting logistics, kind of remarks, and then we'll kind of go section by section, guidelines overview, cover the GIS data section, the wildfire mitigation data, and performance metrics. And then in closing remarks, I apologize for my voice. I've been battling a cold for a while, so it's hopefully a little better today, but my voice will be kind of probably going in and out a little bit, so I do apologize. Next slide, please. Just some basic logistics. Please mute yourself during the session presentations. Any verbal comments and questions will be taken at the end of each session. Please raise your hand on Zoom when you have a question or comment. Written comments can be entered into the Q&A window at any time. All comments will be recorded and evaluated for consideration. Questions will be answered if time permits. Please identify yourself to keep the discussion organized. And this workshop is being recorded and will be posted on our website shortly after we have the recording. Next slide, please. And kind of the objectives, the relevant documents. Hopefully folks have been able to review the guidelines, the draft templates that we have, the geodatabase template, the mitigation tables and performance metrics. Again, the objective of this workshop is to provide an overview of the guidelines and documents and the changes and to receive any kind of input and comments on the guidelines and answer any questions when possible. Next slide, please. All right, and with that, we will start kind of with an overview of the draft data guidelines. Slide. I'm going to kind of overview structure of the guidelines is, kind of first section is the introduction. The second section is the submission standards. The third section is the geographic information system or GIS data. Section 4 is our mitigation data, and then a few appendices. Different staff will be presenting on these parts of the data guidelines. Starting off, I will, for the next slide, turn this over to Jenny Reed, who will kind of cover introduction to the guidelines and the submission standards. Next slide, please. And Jenny, feel free to take it away.
Thanks, Stephen. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. So I'm going to cover a few slides about the submission standards that apply to both the GIS data and to the wildfire mitigation data tables. So the data standards, we talk about the when they'll become effective, for which reporting period they'll become effective, and there's a split between the GIS portion and the wildfire mitigation data tables, and there's a table that gives that information, and you can see that it will be the wildfire mitigation data tables will become effective Q4 of 2022, and the GIS data changes or the new guidelines Q1 of next year. And I think there were some questions about that, and like Stephen said, the questions will be addressed at the end. Next slide, please. At the end of the section, not the end of the presentation, sorry. Okay, so for each data submission, there's a reporting period that is covered by the submission, and there's a submission date when the data is provided to Energy Safety. And there's a table in the guidelines that outlines when those are. As you can see, each reporting period, at the conclusion of the reporting period, a calendar month is provided for processing the information from the reporting period into the submission, and that's reflected in the submission date in the table. Next slide, please. Okay, so there's the general high-level data submission instructions address the various data sets and their locations. There are a couple different locations. I would say probably the changes here are that you know, now we have incorporated the wildfire mitigation data tables, and you can see each data set where it's to be located, whether it's on the SharePoint or the docket, the filing docket, and then also the addition of revisions. And so if there are revisions to a data set, then the revision should be submitted in the same location as the original submission for like whatever's being revised. And if there are any questions on this, please bring it up at the end of the section. And yeah, next slide, thanks. This is new in these data guidelines, addressing revisions to previously submitted data. The intention here is to clarify when data is being revised, and so that energy safety is aware of when a change is being made. Some of the submission templates contain representations of past information. And so the intention here is to clarify that those past reporting periods shouldn't just be revised in new submissions just because there's a field there. If a previously reported actual or target is revised, then those revisions should follow the procedure that's provided. And yeah, there might be questions about this, but I think that the instructions pretty much speak for themselves. So we'll get into any questions there. And oh, okay. And so the utility initiative tracking ID, the electric corporations must now use this utility initiative tracking ID through the WMP. And in previous years, the electrical corporations track mitigation initiatives using the section numbers in the WMPs. But the utility initiative tracking ID is now a unique tracking ID for a given initiative. So that ID must match the field in the same initiative for all of the QDR submissions through the life cycle of the QDR. So this just helps to eliminate any confusions if there are numbering changes in the document. It divorces the data tracking from those kind of numbering changes, and it helps to give a better tracking mechanism for the initiative throughout the WMP lifecycle. And see if there's any, yeah, I think that covers it. If you guys have questions, bring them up. Oh, we're already to questions. Okay. Are there any hands raised right now?
Currently, there are no hands raised.
Okay, and if there aren't any questions right now, you know, just because we moved on to another section, I think it's safe to say that, you know, at the end of after all the sections have been presented, if you think of something and want to go back and bring up a question from a previous section, that's fine.
We do have one hand raised.
Okay.
Hi, this is Ian Fisher from Public Advocate's Office. I just want a point of clarification. If there were questions submitted on Monday, when will those be addressed?
Oh, the submissions, the questions submitted before the workshop in writing, we're gonna address those as we go. And some of them require more internal discussion, so they might not be addressed on this call, but the ones that that we are gonna address, we will bring up. And you're free, if we don't address something, you're free to bring it up, even if it's already been submitted.
Okay, thank you.
And if there aren't any other hands, I see, is there something in the chat?
Currently, I do not see anything in the chat.
Oh, I see something that says, can you please answer the questions we submitted in these areas? Let's see. That was from Lena McMillan. Lena, can you identify your organization, since that might help me to find your questions? I see her hand
Yes.
raised.
Hi.
Okay.
This
Hi.
is Millen from SD Genie.
Okay.
And the questions we submitted on Monday, there are, I believe, 3 general questions that are relevant to the slides you just shared.
I will. Okay, so I see one about a question about resubmission, kind of clarifying about the guidance on revisions to actuals and targets. Is that one of the ones that you're referring to?
Yes, that's one.
Okay, so maybe you can clarify. So I'm going to read the question so that everyone on the call can hear it. Can Energy Safety provide clarification on the resubmission of actuals and targets? Is this an opportunity for IOUs to change targets that don't otherwise qualify for a change order? Are you referring to the fact that the submission template sometimes contain a field for a previous time period? Like, is that opening the door to changing that because it's on the template?
Okay, not that question specifically, sorry. So I'll just ask here. We sometimes see lagging completions, right? So when we submit our quarterly reporting, it's a snapshot in time of what we have completed in the system on the day we run that report. In future reporting periods, we could see additional completions from a prior reporting period come in just due to our processes for completing work in the system. And so the requirement to resubmit amendments, I guess, to the reports could become overly burdensome, and the volume could be very high for resubmitted reports, although the volume of changes is very, very, very low. So the question here is, what's the acceptable variance, or is there a threshold for when the utility is required to resubmit a report for previous reporting periods?
Are you, just to get some clarification, so are you saying that in the cases that you're describing, how would you currently be reporting those?
We
Or
would
how do you?
Yeah, so for we'd be reporting those in the QIU because it's year-to-date cumulative progress.
Okay, so you're saying that like those just differ and that's just how it is, and you weren't previously handling those, you know, through any other process?
Correct.
Okay, so I think that's a question that we would have to clarify with policy about what their expectations are. I mean, I could handle it. I could say from a data perspective, how I would recommend it, but policy, I think, needs to speak to, you know, how they want to see that play out. So thank you for clarifying, you know,
Hi,
the
Jenny.
question.
This is Lucy from policy. So, Lena, are you talking about if you've reported something to us and then you've realized that that reported information is incorrect?
It's not necessarily that the reported information was incorrect. It's just that the reporting period, when we run a report for the reporting period, that's just a snapshot in time. So it's correct as of when we submitted it.
I can probably add a little bit of information that I think wasn't stated explicitly, but that might help Lucy and Jenny. I'm pretty sure that we're narrowly talking about initiatives data here. Is that, can you confirm that that's really what this is about?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So I just wanted to put that out there. I understood that based on the context, but because we're talking about this whole data standard, which includes a lot of other stuff, without saying that explicitly, people might be imagining we're talking about different things. And so the issue, which I understood, is sometimes a physical thing in the world was actually done by the end of the reporting period, but the utility doesn't have a record of it until after that. So
I guess that was my question, was, would that then just roll into the following, like in your current reporting, would that completion just roll into like the quarter when you realized it was complete instead of revising the quarter where it was actually complete? Like you're not just losing it off the page, right? Like it's
Right.
getting reported somewhere.
Yes.
Okay. That's what I thought. So I think, again, that might be a question for, like, Lucy, you don't have to speak to it off the cuff, but maybe that's a question for policy to say, you know, how much does it matter? Do you want to know, like, we realized today that this completed 6 weeks ago in the prior reporting period, or even last week in the prior reporting period. Does that mean update your reporting for the prior quarter, or do you just count that as we finished it this quarter? That's something you speak to.
Yeah, I think based on my understanding, I think of the question, we would want the updated information sort of resubmitted for that quarter if the data has changed. I mean, Lena, you can email me offline if you want to elaborate further or have an additional conversation about it, but that's my position based on my understanding of the question that's being asked.
And I can also just kind of say that we've discussed other, Brian, you and Lena mentioned initiatives statusing or completion, but, you know, risk events seems like something that, you know, a risk event might take place close to the end of the reporting quarter, and information about that event may arise after the completion of the quarter. So, you know, it seems like the same thing would apply there. Like, if we know something after the reporting period is done, do we revise the information? You know, do we revise that? And it sounds like, you know, Lucy, you're saying yes. Compliance might have another perspective. So if there's more, I would say the short answer right now would be yes. The quarter in which something happened, if you have more information about that after the reporting period is concluded, the guidance that's provided is intended to say, here's how you give us the, you know, more complete information that you have now that you didn't have during the reporting period, or when the reporting period was submitted. Does that answer your question, Lena?
I believe the short answer to the question, yes, I believe you answered the question. And I would just note that it could become very overly burdensome, and the volume of amended reports could be higher than expected, just due to the fact that, you know, the utilities have kind of lagging completions trickle in over time.
Okay. I think that, you know, we're going to pass this on to policy and compliance, like beyond just this workshop, to consider. If there's any more data that you can provide to kind of support the idea that the volume would be burdensome, maybe for you and for energy safety, that would be helpful. If those changes have been just rolling into their kind of when they're realized, that we would probably be a little bit blind to that. So yeah, if there's any other kind of context or supporting context that you can provide, then we'll get that to compliance and policy to consider.
Okay, thank you.
Was there another hand?
Yes, we have Melissa Boyd from PG&E.
Okay. Are you there, Melissa?
Yes. Can you guys hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
Perfect. Thank you. Just coming off of mute. I just wanted to add to what Lena was saying is essentially a lot of our source systems, right, are as built what data looks like today, but it's constantly changing. So in some cases, the best representation of the quarter data is always tomorrow. And so I think we're just trying to avoid having to resubmit data and cover letters for what is correct today, but then tomorrow might be more complete because that would be the case for some time thereafter.
Okay. Okay, so I'm noting that too, just kind of that explanation. I think you're just kind of capturing, like saying the best representation of today is always tomorrow. I mean, I think that's a short way.
Yeah,
of
and I can give you
the problem.
like just a quick example, right? We do jobs and work out in the field and the jobs are complete, but maybe they might not be mapped in our GIS source system, until they've gone through the proper QC. So you wouldn't see those in necessarily at the end of the quarter close. And so each day we have more and more work that gets mapped that would reflect what we did last quarter. So it's always a little bit more accurate as we get more of that data into our source systems. And I think it does also go beyond, is sometimes there are ignitions that are still being investigated or outages that are being investigated. So it just takes a little bit more time to have more reflective data post quarter end.
Okay, well, it sounds too like some of this discussion is touching not just on the resubmission guidance that's provided in the data guidelines, but also like the implications for like the change order process in the WMP guidelines. So, that's probably a larger discussion that can't conclude or totally take place during the workshop. But from a data perspective, I would say that like there's an awareness of the reality that you're describing. And on the data side, we have to find a way to provide compliance with accurate information about when things happened. And, that just might necessarily mean, revisions, right? Because we know something happened, but we don't know everything about it yet. So maybe the process by which we do that needs to be improved. But I don't foresee the answer being that we either won't want the information or that we won't want the information tied to the accurate time of when it took place. Does that make sense?
Yes, and a little separate of the change order, but yes, just I think it was just with what Lena was saying is our data does change and is a little bit more reflective every day. And so wanted to make sure that there's a certain threshold for when you would look for resubmittals.
Is there anything on the data side? Just one more quick question. Is there anything in the data guidelines specifically that you would want to change or improve about the resubmission? I mean, I'm just from a data perspective, I'm viewing it as there's a record. The record either wasn't submitted for the prior period or it was submitted and now it has more information or different information. So, if that record was submitted, then, you're just going to resubmit the record. And so if you could speak to just on the technical side, since that's kind of our area, if there's any specific recommendations that you have now, or if you want to submit them later, then that would be helpful and appreciate that.
Perfect. I would only ask the same thing, that we establish a threshold for, margin of updates where it would be appropriate to make those changes on targets or actuals. But then for the spatial report, it does take time to produce a file geodatabase. Even if we're just producing one table, the intent is to show these relationships between all of the reports. So would ask that any changes on the spatial report be allowed in a tabular format, if we could make that request. Since again, the intent is to show the relationship between all data sets, and that would be missing if just a single table was provided spatially.
Okay, I'm noting
I'll-
all of
I'll
that.
kind of chime in on this. I think a lot of this also is a case-by-case data set on how this is tackled in a sense. Like speaking with the spatial data, we do have, and we'll get into that next with Brian, but some of our spatial data, we do have guidelines or kind of guidance on kind of this update aspect of when do we need to see updates and whatnot based on the type of data sets we're asking for. So I think we all understand this question, and I think it's not a kind of straightforward answer because each data set's a little different from what we're asking for. And I think this kind of when does data get submitted for updates and whatnot is kind of really a case by case.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.
All right, I'm just looking.
All right. And then we do have a hand up from Aaron
Oh.
H.
Okay,
Hi, Jenny, can you hear me?
yes.
Okay, Jenny, yeah, so Erin from SDG&E. Collectively, we just wanted to ask about kind of the purpose between choosing the different timelines for implementing the tabular and the spatial data. We have some, I guess, some reservations around the dependencies. And as we try to automate this whole process and WMP as a whole, there's a lot of interdependencies that we would have to accommodate for that one period. And I guess we just want to understand why and why that was set up that way.
Okay, I will, anyone want to
try and
jump on
answer
this? Okay.
I'll try and give an answer to this.
Okay.
So the difference in the timelines, start with the spatial data first. We do know that takes a while to implement, hence the later date. The reason for the earlier date for the wildfire mitigation data is because that data is utilized for the evaluation plans. That's that data, the Q4 data is submitted in February of early next year, along with the plans. That's why that data needs to be ready sooner than the spatial.
Okay. Are there certain components, like instead of submitting, are there certain tables that would have dependencies that, I mean, I understand you guys need that information, but are there certain tables that could be considered for Q4 versus Q1, or you guys are pretty confident on having tables 1 through 13 all being submitted in Q4 in the new format?
Right now, everything is Q4 in the new form.
Okay, and is there, I know in the guidelines, you guys constantly say that there's a, we just want to see progress, right? Doing nothing is not acceptable, but as long as you're showing that you're working towards it. So is there an expectation that it is 100% completed, or is there an expectation that we're working towards that for Q4, and then we'll have it completely transitioned over for Q1?
I mean, say the expectation is that the data will be filled out for the Q4 submissions.
In the new format.
In the new format, yes. Then I'll kind of open it up to Lucy on our policy side if she wants to chime in any further on that. But the expectation is that the new format will be followed in time for the Q4 submission, which is due in February 1st of 2023.
And just to follow that, Stephen, I just wanted to know if you have a timeline for when it'll be finalized and not a draft at the same time.
Oh, that's a good question. Don't have an exact. Obviously, we'll have to take back the comments we have and anything we get with the comment period that ends at the end of the month. Our hope, obviously, we want to get it as ready as soon as possible. So I can't give an exact timeline, but our hope would be, if we, depending on the comments we get and what we feel is worth incorporating,
Right.
It'll be shortly thereafter. So
Okay, thank you.
again, it's
Also,
all pending
Aaron-
on what we get.
Aaron, also, if they're between like tables 1 through 13, if there are specific tables that, or aspects of certain tables that you're seeing as, specifically problematic, then, to implement in time, then that might be good information,
Okay.
to help with considering the question, rather than just all of the tables, and I know you're kind of asking the reverse. I
Yeah.
heard you asking from the WMP side, are there specific tables that are more informative to the WMP submissions than others? And, but then like your side of that is, are there tables that are, regardless of that, are there tables that are flagging as harder for you guys to implement? So that would help too. And if you
Okay,
could-
Jenny, yeah, thank you. We can get back to you on that as well.
okay, thanks.
Yeah.
All right. And then lastly, we do have a question from Ryan Stevenson. They state that SCE submitted some general questions for this area as well. This section of the PowerPoint here.
All right, let me pull up SCE's questions and sorry, there was a lot of questions from SCE, so I'm trying to see which ones I flagged them more on topically, and I didn't have anything that was flagging for this this section. So
Yeah, I'm going to suggest we just have Ryan come off mute and verify whether we've essentially addressed it with the questions that we've already fielded, or
Yeah.
if there was anything else.
Thanks, Brian. Is the questioner there?
Ryan, looks like you're unmuted. I don't know. Can you?
If he's unmuted, we're not hearing you, Ryan.
Yeah, we're not hearing anything. Sorry.
Maybe enter in the chat if you're there. I'm trying to speak, but we can't hear you. We can come back to.
Yeah, we can also circle back to this if it turns out there were unanswered.
Yeah,
questions.
I'm looking through, Ryan, I'm looking through the SCE questions, and I'm just not flagging anything that I thought was from this section. So we do have your questions noted, but mostly for other areas. But if you want to come off mute or enter in the chat, then we could circle back to that. Oh, there you are. Questions in the first section. Oh, I think you covered some of them. That was already what was already there. Okay. Okay, so then we'll move on now. Brian, handing it over to you. We'll move on now to the GIS section, and then if Brian comes back with something later in the question sections, we'll circle back. Thanks, guys.
All right. Thanks, Jenny. Good afternoon, everybody. Hope everyone had their second cup of coffee. I sure did. So hopefully we're all on the same page with that. Yeah, I'm just going to give a brief overview of the spatial data portion. You can go to the next slide, please. And so to not read this, I'll sort of paraphrase it. Really, the purpose of the spatial data portion of the quarterly data reports is the idea that we have a common informational picture with the utilities. So we have the same understanding of the infrastructure, the risk events that are impacting that, and the initiatives that are being undertaken, what the targets are for those, and sort of how they're moving along. And that's really the purpose of the spatial data, and our policy team and our compliance team are using those data to evaluate the sort of performance of the wildfire mitigation plans and how those are progressing. This version of the guidelines, which, as Jenny mentioned previously, we're rolling together now some things that used to be described, documented separately. And so this what's now released as draft is what we're calling version 3 of the spatial data portion. It's in the same guidelines as the wildfire mitigation tabular data, which have probably been revised, but we haven't done version numbers for those before. So just in terms of the version number for the spatial data, we're calling this 3.0. We can go to the next slide. And so just as an overview to start off, these are the sort of logical groupings that we've come up with for the spatial data. We haven't changed anything here. This has been how we've organized the GIS data all along. And I'm gonna just put this in because I'm gonna sort of go through the changes that we have by data set, although I'm gonna start with some that are sort of generic to the whole spatial data submission. A couple simple changes that we sort of tried to implement all over the place. And I'm also going to say before I launch into the specific changes, I'm not going to cover every last little thing because we would be here all day just talking about the spatial data. I'm going to try to mention some higher level changes that we implemented, but there are some small detailed changes that I probably won't discuss. And we do have a change log that should be comprehensive. And I know that I think that we did not distribute that yet, but we've said before that we would do this, and we will have a final change log based on whatever changes come out of anything we might change based on questions we've gotten or anything from our draft to our final, whenever that does get published. We will have a comprehensive change log that should list every little last thing that we've changed. So with that, I'm going to move on. We can go to the next slide. So an overview of changes that we tried to make across the entire submission. One thing that I know we've gotten a question about is we've removed the confidential fields from all of the data sets. That was something that was not in the data set. Initially, we were asking for confidentiality to be reported in the status reports. And we've received some comments and questions about the confidential field in the past. And it seemed like that idea, which I thought was going to be very helpful, was not as helpful as we thought it would be. And we've decided that it makes more sense just to take that back out of the spatial data at this point. Another thing that we've done, we've removed several fields that we felt like we did not need, and if there was any information that we were collecting that wasn't necessary, we're trying to remove that. So just expressing an overall goal, we don't want to be collecting information that's not absolutely necessary. We're aware that this is a very large data set as it is, so we're looking at any opportunities to streamline. And so information that could be gleaned from other publicly available data. I mean, the whole point of collecting spatial data, as I'm sure all of the other spatial data people on this call are aware, is you can use layers information that you get from one source with publicly available information or information from other sources. So county, what district we're in, things like that, we've removed. A global change is we've added fields to have the ability for any utilities that have stable IDs for portions of conductor that are smaller than a whole circuit to report on that. So that impacts the asset line feature, but it also impacts any other data set that can be tied to that. And we're hopeful that, at least we know we've heard that some of the utilities don't have permanent stable IDs. We're hopeful that anybody who does is able to utilize that, because obviously you get a much more granular connection between some event or some initiative and where did that actually happen, as compared to using a circuit ID as a unique ID, which a circuit can be quite a lot of conductor over quite a large area. We also added fields to identify what feature to join to in, I'm going to say, any place where we had requested unique IDs, if that unique ID could have come from various sources. And that, again, that just enables us to make that connection more easily as compared to what we've had to do in the past, which is take a unique ID that could be from one of several data sets and test it against all of them to find what that's actually going to. Okay, we can go to the next slide. All right, so other than those sort of global changes that I just mentioned, some of which do apply to the asset points and lines, changes just for the asset point and lines, basically the fundamental infrastructure data sets. We've added risk fields to the support structure and asset line data. Previously, we had asked for the risk evaluations as a separate data set, and we've just integrated that now. And the reason that it's in both is that based on the data we received previously, we understood that some utilities are evaluating some of their infrastructure based on the risk at the poles, and some of their infrastructure based on the risk at for the segments. And so we've just given you the ability to report that either way. And obviously, based on that, if any given utility doesn't perform their risk analysis based on poles, then you don't need to have risk data for poles. We just need to make sure that we have that risk data for whatever it's calculated against. And we've just given you the ability to report it in either place. We changed a few fields in the transformer feature and the transformer detail table to just better reflect how transformers are actually installed on the network. I'm not going to go into the weeds on that one, but just be aware that there are changes there. Hopefully, those changes enable reporting that actually makes more sense for how transformers function on the in the network. We also added a new detail table that is to capture the one-to-many relationship between transmission lines and substations. That was not very well captured previously. And similarly, we added another detail table to capture the one-to-many relationship between support structures and conductor that they support. And both of those we implemented based on feedback that we got from the last session where we met with all the utilities about how the utilities track that and what would be a more sensible way for them to report, because there are obviously different ways to capture those relationships. And so hopefully we've implemented that in a way that makes sense to the people who are managing the data. Finally, we've added a pole number field to the support structure feature. So that is intended to capture the actual plate visible ID that would be on the pole. That was something that we hadn't had previously. We had a unique ID, but that's often, I think almost in all cases, it turned out that was a software ID. And so the unique ID per pole that we were getting before was not what you would see if you walked up to the pole in the field. And rather than replace that in case those aren't unique IDs or they're not what the utility is using, we just added that as a separate field. Okay, and so that is the sort of high level changes for asset points and lines. Again, that's not an exhaustive list, but those are all the sort of high level things that we implemented in this version. Next slide, please.
Brian, we do have a hand raised. Do you want to take a question now, or would you prefer to take them at the end of the section?
Let me defer to Stephen on that. I'm fine to do these sort of data set by data set, but I think we had previously asked to wait to the end. Stephen, what do you want to do?
I think we're just going to wait for the end.
Okay, great. So yeah, see the hand. Well, let me get through all the data sets, and then we'll do questions for the GIS section together. Stephen.
Yes.
Sorry to make you come off mute twice. I just wanted to make sure I understood.
No worries.
So that's what we're doing. So for the public safety power shutoff, the PSPS data set, we made a minor change just in the requirement for what data to submit. So this isn't actually a change in the structure. We haven't changed what features exist for PSPS or the structure of those features. We are just now saying that we want all three geometries. So that's customer meter points, PSPS lines, and PSPS polygons anytime that there is a PSPS event. We have added information about the vegetation related to the damage detail tables for PSPS. That's one that only is going to be needed information if there was vegetation involved. We previously were asking whether there was vegetation involved, but we didn't have any extra information. So the data we've added for vegetation for PSPS looks just like data that we were asking for other places where vegetation was involved in risk events previously. We have taken vegetation contact. We've sort of elevated it. That is now a unique cause that we're asking for, where previously per the schema that was described as object contact, and then the object was specified as vegetation. We had interest from our users, being our policy and compliance divisions, to have vegetation contact be clearer. So we're putting that at what essentially is the top level, which is the cause. Finally, we have moved the damage date and time from the damage detail tables to the damage point, because conceptually if that happened at a certain time, that applies to that location where there was damage. And there was no need to have that be different for any of the detail tables that might be related to the singular point of saying damage occurred in this place. So that, again, that should just be simpler to report that. When did this happen in one place, which is the main feature, which is the damage point. Okay, next slide. Okay, so for the risk event data set, we have consolidated outages into one feature, and we just added the fields that were in the vegetation caused outage features. And so previously there were basically 4 features for outages. There's a separate transmission and distribution feature, which actually had all the same fields, and then there were subsets for the vegetation. And we've just put that all into one. That meant that we added a field that says for each outage, was this transmission or distribution? And so that really doesn't change anything. We're getting all the same information. Just be aware that that's probably going to change your ETL process if you have one, because you're now directing those all into one feature. Again, on the veg, so those veg fields that exist now, obviously, those only need to be filled out if the cause was vegetation related. We have eliminated the risk event asset log, which was just a table. And we have taken the information that was in there, which was essentially just the asset, the unique ID of the asset that was involved. We just added that to the features that they need to be in. That's a simpler approach, and we're getting rid of a whole log that existed, really just to get that one ID. Simplified the ID fields in the photo log, and that required adding a single field which just identifies whether this is a before or after photo. That just allowed us to eliminate some fields where we were reporting information in many, in 4 or 5 fields, and we can get it down to basically 2. We have added some options to the cause fields. Those options are based on common items that we were seeing in the comment. The goal here is, if there's something that happens all the time, to just give the utilities the ability to report that directly, rather than having to say the cause is other and then fill out a comment field. And finally, we have added customer request, government agency request, and emergency repairs to the cause options for outages. Again, those are things that we were seeing that weren't handled well in our previous domain or pick list for that. Things that happen that cause outages that were being reported that we didn't necessarily anticipate when we created this data set in the first place. And so again, we're just hopeful that that's going to give us more clarity on why some of these things are happening, rather than having to get an other and go look in a comment field. Okay, next slide. Okay, big change for the initiatives data set. We have eliminated the log tables. So previously, a lot of information about the initiatives has been in a log table that can be then related back to the individual point, line, polygon features. We have now just taken all of those attributes that we needed from the table, and we've put that in the individual features. We have added a field called initiative class. This is intended to capture whether the activity is essentially something that the utility is choosing to do on its own for wildfire mitigation, or is this a required activity like clearances for vegetation or required inspections for assets. We have added a data capture sensor type field to the inspection features. That is basically intended for inspections that are done with some instrument that permanently records data. We would like to know what that is, and that was not clearly identified in the previous schema. It was often hard to figure out exactly what that excuse me. So that only applies to inspections, really we're talking, we're thinking about things like LiDAR, infrared. There's probably other examples that I can't come up with right now, but I just want to emphasize this is explained in the guidance, but we're not looking for information about tools that say a person is using in the field. We're looking for if there's actual data being captured, like LiDAR data, and that's being used, then that's what we want to know. We've added 3 new features. So there's a point, a line, and a polygon for audits of initiatives. Those are generic. So if there are field audits that are done on any initiative, you can use that same feature to describe those. So, conceptually, if vegetation inspections are being audited and grid hardening, some percentage of grid hardening work is being audited, all of that would be reported in the same feature. And like the other initiatives, it's really the utility's choice whether to use the point, the line, or the polygon. We're not asking for all of those. We're giving maximum flexibility by having a point, a line, and a polygon. Whatever the utility is able to report for audits of initiatives that they're doing, there should be a template for that. For vegetation management projects, we have added an explicit field for clearance distance. That was something that didn't exist before. And so for clearances that are above requirements, we're asking for what this explicit distance was that was implemented for any given project. And finally, for asset inspections, we've added fields to capture the number of findings. And I just want to point out that is tied to the GEO 95 requirements. So that's a CP that's specified by CPUC. We're just asking for how many of what level of finding was identified by the inspection. Next slide. Okay, and I think this is our last data set. Yes, okay, so the other required data, which is sort of a catch-all, the only change I want to mention is that we've got a new feature in there, which is the high wind warning day polygon. That is essentially similar to the red flag warning day polygon that we were already, that was already included. It should look essentially the same. We're just asking for reporting of any high wind warnings that occurred during each quarter. And with that, I think we can go to questions.
Hey, Brian, were there any questions we received you want to answer?
I probably have to
Different
rely on
spot,
Jenny
but-
because I don't have the list pulled up because I think Jenny does. But
Currently, we don't have any open questions and nobody has their hand raised. Oh, here we go. Go ahead, Landy. Landy, we are currently unable to hear you.
yeah, Landy, you're unmuted, and if you are speaking right now, we are not hearing you. And so if that's the case, and if you have a question, I'm going to suggest that you type it in and we will read it back and answer it. But in the meantime, if anyone else, I see both Aaron and
Yes, we have a question from Aaron.
Hi, thanks for taking my question again. I just wanted to get clarity. You didn't talk about, I guess, just some clarity around the audit field, the audit feature class. So actually, you know what? I'm gonna skip that. I'm sorry. yeah, I think Lena's probably, or Daniel's probably better to speak to that. So I apologize. Thanks.
That's okay. And that's one, thank you. You reminded me when Stephen asked me if there were any questions. I know that I didn't mention this when I went over, but I know that we got a question about that, or probably from more than one utility. And that's one that I have to go to my users of the data with. Basically, it was a good question. I need to forward it to our compliance folks and make sure that we have a good answer before I commit to anything. But I saw the question about what is the scope of these and understood it. And I think we will need to provide more clarity in the guidelines about what exactly we are considering to qualify as an audit, if that makes sense. And I believe that was the question.
Okay, next we have a question from Ian Fisher.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent, that's good to hear. So Ian Fisher, Cal Advocates. I did submit 3 questions in regard to geospatial. Should I go through them now?
If there's something that you want to discuss with us, yes.
Yeah, that's why I submitted them on Monday. So,
Right.
First question is with regard to changing the confidentiality attributes. Totally agree that it doesn't need to be on every row of the data set. How are you marking it up in each file, or how are you expecting it to be marked up in each file? That's what I want to understand. It's going to be, as I understand it, it's going to be in the data sheets, so you'll be able to identify whether a particular field or attribute is confidential from the data sheets. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's the goal, is that we would get that in the status report, because as you mentioned, that's actually more flexible. So that allows people to say this, not instead of this exact record is confidential, possibly most of this data set is not confidential, but this attribute is confidential, or some portion of this data set is confidential, or whatever. So yes, that should be in the status report, with the caveat that I think we still need to clarify with our legal team exactly. There may be other requirements for how we need to capture confidentiality.
So exactly, yeah. So that gets to my second part of the question. In the actual GDB itself, is there anything going to be in the metadata associated with each feature that identifies a feature as confidential, or any intent to do that, or is that still under sort of assessment?
On the last thing you said, yeah, still
Okay.
under consideration.
Yeah, just that would strike me as something that needs to be addressed. Okay, so that's question 1. Question 2, on you're asking for risk calculations as fields within various initiative tables. Where I ask, where do we find out about the provenance of that risk value? Is that going to be in the data sheets as well?
I did see that. So there is a large section in the actual wildfire mitigation plan that details how each utility calculates their risk. And so the reason that information was not originally included along with the risk score was the thought that essentially getting the risk score in the data would be enough. And if you wanted to understand how that was calculated, you would go look at the wildfire mitigation plan.
It's not so much wanting to know how it was calculated, just wanting to know the version of whichever risk model is being used and which risk model is being used. It refers to, given that there are potentially multiple risk models out there for a given year.
For a given year, yeah, that may be something that we need to consider. Again, that's if we need to add that, we can add that to the standard. I probably need to have more discussion with the people on our policy team who really know the nuts and bolts of how the risk gets calculated to make sure that my understanding of that was correct.
So just by way of illustration, and not to pick on PG&E, but they have 17 different risk models associated, and there may be we need to just know which risk model is being used, which score that risk, where the score originates, which risk model the score originates in. For a particular initiative, and it might be a composite, it might be the vegetation model, it might be the asset model, but you just don't know unless it's kind of identified within the data set itself.
Yeah, sorry, I just want to backtrack and make sure that what I just heard isn't based on a misunderstanding. So you said initiative. We've asked for risk scores on the assets, not on the initiatives.
Well, okay, on the asset. So again, it may be where's the problem? It's still fair point. My mistake. My concern still stands is exactly what model is being identified.
Absolutely, yeah. I just wanted to make sure it was.
No, I get what you're saying. I misspoke. I apologize.
That's what I thought it was, and that's what I was hopeful. But I just wanted to make sure. So yes, I think you've identified something that potentially we may need to add as either an attribute or just in metadata. And so, like I said, I just need to dig into that a little more. But it's possible that in our final version, we will add information about the risk model ID. Again, either as an attribute or in metadata, whatever is more appropriate and works better.
Okay.
Can I ask a clarifying question on this to Ian?
Sure.
This is Jenny Reed again,
Okay.
from the data team. Just so that I understand, are you suggesting that any data point that is a risk score or holds a risk score should include the risk score provenance in the data? That if it's discussed in the WMP, are you saying that that's not sufficient? It should also be in the data any time that comes up?
No, not necessarily. Either it needs to be in the documentation somewhere, in the data, in the worksheet documentation somewhere, the feature data sheets somewhere, or it needs to be in some sort of description, some sort of metadata within the feature, but not necessarily. It doesn't have to be at the row, individual feature level necessarily.
Okay, but the WMP itself isn't, you're saying that that's not enough. It's not just okay to discuss it. You want to see it tied to the data submission.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
I just wanted, because risk score, even though maybe there's only a risk score collected in this one, who knows what the future holds. So I just wanted to kind of get what your kernel of the point was. Thank you.
My concern is that you may have different models floating around at different times. And certainly if you start working between years and between quarters, you're going to have different models, and the score is going to be represent a different model. And so we just need to know what that model is for that particular quarter. And it would be better if it's somewhere submitted with the data set, the actual data itself, rather than off in the WMP.
Thank you.
Yeah, does that make sense?
Yep. Okay.
And then I have one last question, which is getting a bit into the weeds, and this is to do with initiatives. With things like undergrounding and certain other grid hardening initiatives, you may get movements and change of location of transmission line, of distribution lines of the actual line, the asset itself. The risk associated with that line will be where the line used to be, not where the initiative is being built. Have we got or can you envisage some sort of method of tracking line removals in relationship to, say, undergrounding or line additions? Is that just too weedy?
Could be me. Maybe I need a third cup of coffee. I'm not quite sure I follow. And
okay.
Sorry, just one more time. I want to point out, you mentioned risk in relationship to initiatives. We're asking for risk in relationship to assets.
Nope, I've changed subject now.
Okay, cool.
So you are undertaking an initiative to reduce the risk of wildfire. Let's start at the beginning. That risk is associated where the line currently is. If you move that line and underground it, for example, and you move it to a different place, the risk is still associated with where it used to be. I want to know how we can track that in the future. Because you've got two events occurring in the system. You've got an undergrounding event, which is the initiative, and you've got a line removal event, 2 rows of data. They need to be linked in some way. And I'm just trying to work out how you do that. maybe that's a question for somebody else.
Yes,
Sorry, man. Sorry.
No, it's okay.
Sorry,
It's a good question. It's possibly more of a philosophical than a data question. I
Well,
think.
this is Jenny again. Brian, let me, so, in maybe, I just could be totally out there, but, you know, this may be further addressed in the implementation of the, you know, soon to be required undergrounding plans. So, you know, we probably, since undergrounding is going to become a lot more, you know, kind of like a granular, kind of look, at what's going on, what's getting submitted, and what's going on. I think this, what you're asking about, what's the relationship between, undergrounding outcomes, you know, or actuals in relation to line removals as an initiative. I think that's, you know, we have that noted down as an important, thing to keep in mind with the implementation of that. Is there anything else that you would want to add in that kind of context, or for us to kind of carry on that, item?
Well, just to say, regardless of whether undergrounding as things like SB 884 go forward or not, and we get underground planning through that initiative, I would have thought you need to track the change in risk over time as a consequence of implementation of initiatives because of the WMP. And so that change in location needs to be tracked.
Do you mean
and-
like to
and linked together.
attribute the drop in risk, like to connect the change in the risk score to the action of undergrounding?
Yes, or any other grid hardening aspect for that matter, where you're actually moving the location of the line.
Okay, so I am going to note that down. I think I understand what you're saying, that any type of kind of asset initiative, like where a hardening activity occurs, would theoretically result in a risk reduction.
Yeah.
And you want to be able to see in the data that the, you know, the through line of the risk, the reduction in the risk score can be connected to that action that was taken.
Yes.
Okay, I'm gonna note that down. And you know, that's something that we can consider with policy and compliance, just for continued improvement on how we collect and manage this data.
Thank you. We will submit that as hopefully a bit more sensibly as a comment. Yeah, we'll submit that with comments as well.
Thank you.
No, thank you very much. Yeah, those are my 3 questions on geospatial, on this aspect of geospatial anyway. Thank you.
All right,
Okay.
and it looks like we have a few questions in the Q&A as well.
Thank you. I was just going to say, I'm just going to read these, if that's all right, and because I think I have pretty quick answers for most of these. I'm going to go in order, even though I prefer to go in order of how quickly I can answer them for everyone's sanity. And so we had a question or statement that said the draft template geodatabase did not contain any domains. This is important to complete the validation, verification, and impact of changes of a new version. Is this something that can be provided prior to final feedback of version 3.0 draft guidelines? And so, yeah, someone, and we did see this as a question that was submitted written, someone did notice that there are no actual domains in the template geodatabase, and that was intentional. That's not an oversight. We've identified that the actual creation of domains in the geodatabase is counterproductive because ETL processes do not respect domains, so they do not actually enforce anything for any utility that is automatically loading data into a geodatabase template. They don't actually prevent you from using values that are other than the values that we specified. And so we are still requiring use of specified values. The place that those values are now specified is only in the guidelines. I do understand that probably does present a bit of a hurdle for evaluating where those have changed, because a PDF is not the easiest way to make a comparison. And so I will have to talk to Stephen about how we do this, but we will look at coming up with a way to provide those that's more adaptable to evaluating changes. And I see a hand, so Aaron, do you have a specific follow-up on that?
Yeah, I do. Thank you, Brian. Sorry, I collected my thoughts now. So yeah, so just with respect to that, I guess the only concern is do you not care about case then? So for instance, an example, the database domains would change between uppercase and lowercase, you know, using proper sentence structure. But I see in some cases in the PDF, this has changed. So just to give some understanding from an automation perspective, is changing an uppercase S for C comment to lowercase does require a change. And so we'd have to see that all the way through. So I guess the real question is thank you for clarifying that the domains were actually not included on purpose, and that we won't have those in the database. But I guess just clarity on case sensitivity. Do we have to make changes now to align to the new values listed there? Do we not care about case? That would be more the question. Is we're trying to assess the impact of the changes that we have to make as well. And that would be part of it. Thank you.
And I remember, thank you. I remember that question from the written, and I'm glad that you brought that up again. It was not our intent to make changes in case, and I think I know how that happened, just in our internal preparation of new documents. It sounded from the question we got from SDG&E like you have already gone through the process of identifying where we had sort of arbitrary changes in case of what I would call domain values, even though, again, technically we've removed the actual geodatabase domain. We're still acting like there is a domain for that. Utilities should use the specified values. If SDG&E has already done that and can provide us with where we went astray and accidentally changed case in some value that existed before, it would be great if we can get that. If not, I can go through and do my own comparison. But just in terms of intent, I try very, this is a bit embarrassing. I try very hard not to make arbitrary changes like that, because I do understand that something that makes no difference to a user is ultimately still a problem for an ETL process.
Right.
So I try to make sure that if we had a value before and it was capitalized a certain way, even if that's not what we really want, we have a relatively high threshold for making a change like that, because I don't want to make extra work for anyone that serves really no practical purpose. But again, based on the question that was identified, we obviously went astray with that when we prepared the document and the template this time, and we will get that straightened out as insofar as we can. But if you've already made a report on that, and if you could provide us with that, that would be very helpful.
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. The next question that we have in the chat was, is there a reason the entity relationship diagram was not provided in the draft data guidelines? It has been available in all other versions and is a great reference to understand the intended relationships within the geodatabase and an overall picture of the database. Yes, that did go missing. There were pretty substantial, the short answer is there were pretty substantial changes this time. The ERD was going to have to be recreated from scratch. And given that we thought it was likely that we would have some more changes, we just didn't go through that exercise. But we will prepare an ERD based on what gets finalized, and we'll make sure that we include that in the final version. And if anyone has any further questions, comment, feedback on that, please raise your hands. In the meantime, I'm going to move on. The next question that's in the chat is regarding the line asset feature class. It might be a naming convention issue. From the data architectural perspective, span ID would be more appropriate than segment ID. Can OEIS change this to span ID? These two terms are used and referred differently when it comes to data analytics and data requests. And I see a comment that this person got their audio fixed. So yes, the reason that's not span ID is we don't anticipate that those smaller segments that may be uniquely ID'd in the utility system would be only a single span in most cases. I don't manage data for a utility, but I would imagine that if utilities have stable permanent IDs for portions of their distribution that are smaller than an entire circuit, it's likely that they are between protective devices, or based on some other logical breakdown that's smaller than what's identified as a circuit. And so we did not want to identify something as a span ID when it would in fact not represent only a single span. And Landy, I see that your hand is up. I'm going to unmute you, and hopefully the audio issue is resolved.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yay. So yeah, I don't know about other utility, but I believe it's very common that we are tracking unique global ID per span as well as per segment. So you're absolutely right. So the span is another smaller level than the segment. And then the reason that we would prefer using the span ID is that if you go with this, because currently we actually have to report at the span level because you can have different materials, different on the conductor size if we're looking at the segment. So it's better we aggregate the data at the span level. However, the naming convention makes it very complicated if our data represents span level data, but the name is still remain as a segment ID, which means completely different things. Another perspective regarding the impact downstream is that when we have some initiatives that have to split the segment just so that we can isolate certain customers from being PSPS. So in that case, your segment would change year over year and then would have different segment ID comes in. So it's very hard for us to trace back to the previous segment ID. But however, the span, if that still remain as overhead structure, the span does not change. So we can always trace back to say, okay, even though now we have one segment split into two segments, we can still trace back based on the span instead of tracing back based on the segment. So if we can keep at a span level, it will make a lot of the data query, or as well as the crossing the board, we're all using the same terminology, represent the same data, and especially when it's come to risk scores, it really will make everything cohesive, tied together better. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, heard and understood. I'm sorry. Can I just back up? I'm not sure I caught what utility.
Oh, SDG&E.
SDG&E. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Generally, our goal is to get the most specific information that the utility has available. And so what I'm hearing, which I did not anticipate, is that someone is capable of providing us with span IDs, and that's great. And so without 100% committing to anything at this point, I think what's likely is that we will add that span ID, excuse me, as a field in the final version of this that comes out. I saw that Ian just asked a question about that. So I'm going to go back on what I said earlier, and I'll address that. So the question was, how would span ID impact the number of records? Based on what I'm hearing, it sounds like it wouldn't, because if any utility has those unique IDs and they're already breaking up the lines that are being submitted into individual spans, then it's no change in the number of records. It's just that they would all have their own unique IDs that would be used across the entire spatial data submission, not just the asset lines, but any other features that can be joined to the asset lines. Those would be ID'd using a unique ID per span. If anyone is not already doing that, then they're not going to have a reason to use the unique span ID, and they're not going to have a reason to break their lines up in a more granular way and create a larger number of records, would be my understanding. Okay. And again, I'm going to say, if anybody has further questions or comments on that, please raise your hands and we will circle back to it. But I'm going to move on to the next question that was asked in writing. Question on meters. The California IOUs map to the transformer and not the meter. Is there a purpose for spatially representing meters? Meters are addresses stored in the customer information system and are mapped based on addresses, which may or may not be where the meter actually is. I'm going to answer the question of, is there a purpose for spatially representing meters? Yes, there is a purpose. We have a reason to know what customer meters are where, and understanding that those are likely generated based on addresses. The inaccuracy in exact location generated based on that is not going to be relevant to things that we use the locations of meters for. And so, yes, it is understood that those meter points that are submitted are probably not going to enable someone to pinpoint the precise location of the actual electrical meter on the ground. And that is not the purpose of those. Next question was question on the utility network. Utilities are starting to plan and implement the utility network in the future. Does OEIS see any overlaps or ability to leverage the UN in the future in relation to OEIS geodatabase model? The answer to that is we've looked at, so the utility network is Esri's sort of specific product for utilities. We've looked at that. We have tried to leverage what has been created in our spatial data standard as much as possible. We're not at this time requiring utilities to specifically use the utility network product. And I see a hand raised from Daniel Butler. Daniel, I think you're unmuted. And if you're talking, we can't hear you. So if you're having audio issues, you could type your question into the question and answer box.
I think I also saw Colin's hand up. If Colin, you had anything to add on to?
That was me trying to find the list of people with their hands up instead of raising my own. I apologize.
A run. Daniel, if you're trying to speak, we can't hear you.
It looks like he dropped off, so I'm guessing he was having audio issues and is trying to reconnect. Do we have any other questions? If not, I'm going to suggest that we move on and we can. Oh, I see a raised hand again. Erin?
Yeah, thank you. I'll do my best to help with what Daniel was going to ask. And it was just regarding the latitude and longitude being removed. And so what we understand that it can be derived, absolutely. You know, we're in a geodatabase. We understand that. So what our real question was just, how is the, sorry, I have to just find the team. We are specifying, I think it's your OEIS data compliance team. How will they be using the data without this attribute? This is an attribute. And I don't know if I stated the whole question, so I think that, does that make it clear?
To some extent, I don't believe that anyone needs the, so to back up, as you pointed out, whether or not latitude and longitude are fields in the attribute table, we're getting spatial data. And so we have locations, and we have removed the latitude and longitude field in almost all cases. because we don't want there to be any confusion between the location that's reported in the actual, as the actual location, and a field in an attribute table, which is missing some context, some context as far as how that might have been calculated, what the projection or the datum of that might be, coordinate system, all of that, things that are handled better by the actual underlying location. I don't believe that to the specific question about compliance, I don't believe that our compliance team has any reason to need an explicit latitude and longitude in an attribute table for any data. And I should know, because I mostly support their operations here at Energy Safety. And so I have that I saw the question, and I have that as a note to talk to them to find out if there's any reason, but essentially, we've removed those fields from our data standard, and we worked with our compliance and our policy teams on developing version 3 of the data standard. So that's already been vetted, so that I don't believe that should be a problem.
Okay, and what about for audit? I know any kind of audits that occur, is that something that has been considered if they're going to be asking for it? Are they going to have a GIS tool to be able to go in? I guess that's the only, just trying to play, back and forth to see, is there anything that we would need it for before they're just removed? Obviously, we have it in our underlying data, but just in terms of the database, it would no longer be there as an attribute, so it would have to be derived. Yeah. Right,
and to your point, if we in the future identified any reason to need an explicitly visible representation of the coordinates of a particular point or piece of data, we will calculate that as needed, and that will be a much more reliable source for us.
Okay, so that would be on your side. Okay.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely. I see another typed question. I'm going to read it. It says, question on the future of the file geodatabase. Does OEIS envision map services being the deliverable migrating from the file geodatabase?
Yeah, I can jump in on this.
Yeah, do you want to address that?
I'll jump in on this one. That's a vision, but that's something that has to be worked out. So it is on our radar to possibly one day make that move to everything be delivered via map services via a static geodatabase. But right now, it's a file geodatabase that is the kind of submission vehicle to say. But it is on our radar. It's obviously with multiple utilities at different levels of technology and different ways of delivering information and data. So that's a much larger thing to tackle. And so before we even get there, there will have to be a lot of work, a lot of discussion to figure out how that would be, how that would work out. Because also, obviously, for those who are familiar with that, there are probably a lot of intricacies involved with that as well, especially when it comes to some of the confidentiality, the data sharing aspects. But it is definitely on our radar.
Thanks, Stephen. Last call for any questions on the spatial data portion of the presentation or the data standard. Lena?
Hi there.
Hello.
Hello. Is there a reason why the status report continues to have different tabs for each data set and separate feature classes on each tab?
I remember that question. Yeah, it was started that way. Not a strong reason. If the utilities would prefer that were a single sheet with all of the features. Again, I'm going to tentatively say I think that would work just as well for us. Is that basically the suggestion?
Yeah, that would be our suggestion. Having it on multiple tabs just makes it difficult to analyze and align for common fields and dependencies. So we can definitely include that in our comments.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll also say, this sounds very obvious, but we request that you submit back to us the template in whatever format we publish it in, but whatever manipulation that you wanted to do on that as a source of information, you are welcome to do on your own. Like I said, that sounds fairly obvious, but we will take that into consideration. And like I said, tentatively, I think that probably should work just as well for us. And so if that makes more sense for everyone else, then we can change that. I just want to say that no matter what, there will still be an overview sheet that just identifies what feature is submitted or not submitted and why, because that's sort of a separate level of information from the field specific info.
Okay, thank you. And I do have just one more question on change order fields being included in the spatial QDR. What is the purpose of that? And our recommendation would be like, we can include that in maybe it's more relevant in the tabular non-spatial QDR.
Right, yeah. So generally, the purpose of getting the information in one place or another is just to have a record for any given initiative activity of whether that has been subject to a change order or not, because that over the course of the year, that can change information about that initiative and how it's performed if you were looking back at the submitted WMP or the approved WMP, in either case, to find out what the details about an initiative are. And again, we can take it under consideration to move that out of the spatial data and into just tabular data. But if big picture, if you've noticed from the elimination of some of the log tables and different things, our general direction with this standard has been to move in the direction of putting information, specifically where it applies and is needed, rather than having it removed by one layer and having to do joins and relates to get information. But we'll discuss that internally, and if that's a change that makes sense, then we can implement that and we can have that as just tabular data instead.
Okay, thank you.
I'll just, Brian, this is Jenny, read again. I'm just going to jump on to say that if there are any questions that were submitted ahead of the workshop in writing that don't get covered today, that doesn't mean that we're not looking at them. So all of the questions that were previously submitted will be are being considered.
Thank you, Jenny. Yeah, that's a good point.
All right, I'm not seeing any other hands raised or questions in the Q&A. I think we'll move on to the next section. Again, we have a couple more sections to go, and if we have any time at the end, we can still address the questions. Next, move on to Noe.
Hello, everybody. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
All right, thank you. My name is Noe Rojas, and I'm a research and data specialist here at OEIS. And today I'm going to go over the wildfire mitigation data with you all. I'm going to stick to more of a top level kind of overview of the changes and updates. As you know, a lot of these changes and updates are pretty extensive. So if we were going to try to cover all of those today, it'd take quite a long time. So what I want people to take away from this part of the presentation today is, I just want it to be something helpful that you can take with you and hopefully just kind of help stakeholders understand and use this information today in their submissions, and also any member of the public who might be using these tables to review for themselves. Next slide, please. Just a really quick overview. With regards to this kind of first bullet, I think what we're just trying to get at there is we wanted people to take the data guidelines and the template together and kind of, for our purposes in this section, take those together as the schema. And with regards to the second bullet there, I think it's pretty self-explanatory. And then the third bullet there, what we're getting at is we just want to try to get, we've been trying to get to a point where the spatial data and the non-spatial data is internally consistent with each other. So we're asking folks to, when they submit this data, that they try to make that as a goal to make sure those two things align as much as possible. And I know in the past, there have been issues with things like overhead circuit mile accounts and the ignitions not lining up between the two data sets. So we're just asking that folks try to make sure those two data sets align as best as possible. Next slide, please. And this is just a real just quick list of all the tables as we've put them forward. Table 1 obviously is formally the QIU. Table 12 and 13 are new tables for the year and for this WMP submission cycle. And then obviously some of the other table numbers have moved around. You can go to the next slide. So before we go any further, I also wanted to kind of just go over the two different types of tables that we have in the tabular data. So I'll just start with the first one, which is what I just kind of called the traditional table design, you know, what you would find anywhere in some whatever database. You know, you have your field, you have your record, you have your data type. And in our data guidelines, we have the full outline of the full schema with every field listed and every description and also the field value constraints. You know, this is like what you'd find in any other schema for a database. And so if you go to the next slide, you'll see it's a little different in the way we've put it into our data guidelines, because in the other type of table we have, it's traditionally been more of an Excel-driven type of organization with regards to the table. There's a lot of pre-populated fields. And for that reason, when we did try to put all of that into the data guidelines, it just got really complicated and convoluted. And we didn't really think it'd be helpful for stakeholders to review that. So we just removed a lot of that and just only put in the fields that would be receiving new data or updated with new data to try to make things a little more simpler. And then for everything else, you know, you would just look back to the template to look at the pre-populated fields for the domains and things like that you might need to look at. And so this is just an illustration of kind of just showing the thought process behind that to try to make it a little more clear for people as they go through the data guidelines. You can go to the next slide. And another point, which has already been brought up, but just to kind of show you that through line with regards to the utility initiative tracking ID in the tabular data, that ID will be used specifically in these tables. It's just a way to kind of link those initiatives together through different tables, while also kind of pointing back to the spatial data. You can go to the next slide. Oh, and I also wanted to add that was just a way to track initiatives kind of throughout the years without having to rely on, you know, the traditional WMP numbering system. So table 1, a lot of you are already familiar with this. Is the formerly called just the QIU data set. We've just incorporated it into the wildfire mitigation data tables. To kind of go over every change, I just put up this table for you to kind of just really quickly give you a snapshot of what were the new fields that were added and modified. So if you want to refer to this recording later, you can. Brian did mention a change log that's kind of been in the works. And so we do have one for this table as well that will get into those details. But just for convenience, I put this here if you wanted to just take a look at it. You know, it's all the fields and the description of the fields are outlined in the guidelines. So I won't go into those details here. Again, this is just kind of a really brief overview. You can go to the next slide. So for table 2, essentially what happened was the old table 1 and the old table 2 were taken and combined, and this new table 2 is created out of that. So the first thing I'll start with was in the old table 1, you had a lot of these attributes like HFTD fields, level 1, level 2 findings, distribution versus transmission. Those were embedded in the old like progress metric name field and the metric type field. So what happened is we, in addition to just combining that with table 2, we've removed a lot of those attributes and made them their own standalone fields so that it's easier to just filter and go through this data and analyze it, and with the idea that it would be easier for both utilities and the public to look at this and understand that data and filter as they need it. The table 2, the old table 2, didn't have that much of a change, but that was kind of the idea behind combining these 2 tables. Some of the other changes was that we removed the HFTD zone 1. So now it's just HFTD tier 2, 3, and non-HFTD. And we've also reduced the number of wind warning status types. Before there was like 5, I think, and now we only have 4, which is red flag warning only, high wind warning only, both or none. So those changes were made. You can go to the next slide. And this was in regards to the comments that we received about the new data in table 2. Obviously those comments were received on our end, and those comments were received on our end. So some of those comments basically said that it would be difficult to fill out some of that data. So in the next presentation, they'll go into more details about those metrics that can actually be left blank for Q4 2022 and submitted in Q1 2023. Again, that'll come in the next presentation. You can go to the next slide. Table 3 is essentially unchanged from last year. It was so because in a lot of these tables, we're asking people not to change or alter them. We have this table 3 that you can add any extra data you might want to enter. Again, it's virtually unchanged from last year. The only things we've added, like the blank meaning field, but feel free to fill this out as needed. Table, you can go to the next slide, please. Table 4, so weather patterns. You can see kind of the old version right there. In this initial version, only the red flag warning overhead circuit mile days was listed with HFTD tier breakouts. In the newest version, all of the metrics are broken out by HFTD. And in addition to having the high wind warning status overhead circuit mile days, we added another metric type, which is a red flag warning and high wind warning overhead circuit mile days. Which isn't a sum of the number 1 and number 2 there. It's that metric is actually asking what days you had both of those occur at the same time. And with regards to those definitions of how to make those calculations, if you go to column AI in that in the newest table, you'll see the definitions in how to make those. You'll see how to make those calculations in column AI of that table. In addition, we've also added the fire potential index overhead circuit miles, also broken out by HFTD or HFTD tiers. And again, we've removed a HFTD zone 1 and now just tiers 2, 3, and non-HFTD. You can go to the next slide. Table 5, risk event drivers. So kind of like the other tables, like the other old tables, a lot of this attribute information was embedded in within like the metric type. I think this is pointing back to the old table 7.1, I believe. Yeah. And in the old version of the table, you had, the line type essentially embedded with the sub-cause category, the cause category, and the event category. And so what we did this time around is we went ahead and removed those and made them their own separate fields, again, to try to make things easier for people to populate this data and also go through it. So you're not having to kind of figure out which field to use when you want to separate by line type. And obviously we renamed some of the fields as well. Excuse me, I'm so sorry. Yeah, we've removed some of those. We've changed a lot of those fields as well. So I think that's it for this table here. You can move on to the next one. Next table, please. Thank you. Let's see, table 6. Table 6 has been mostly unchanged. There wasn't really much to report here. It was the old table 7.2. These are the ignition drivers. Everything was broken out by HFTD before, but again, we've kind of gone down to only HFTD tier 2, 3, and non-HFTD. But other than that, it's mostly unchanged. And I just kind of made this really quick graphic here to kind of just show you the fields and their related categories. But there's not a lot of change for table 6 here. Go to the next slide. State of service territory. So this is initially, so the old version of this is where you would get your circuit miles and kind of like underground circuit miles, total circuit miles. So before, like I said, a lot of these tables had a lot of just attributes embedded within these fields, which made it really kind of complicated to just extract the information you needed. It wasn't very clear to the user how to quickly get a lot of this information. You can also see in the old version, you had HFTD tiers in the years up there in the corner, upper right-hand corner. So again, what we did is we pulled a lot of that, a lot of those attributes out and made them their own fields, and also, move the outcome metrics into the metric type section to just try to make things easier for everyone and just allow people to easily filter for what they needed, as opposed to having to dig through all these little fields and cells and try to kind of figure out what you needed to do to get, say, like underground circuit miles. And in addition to that, we've added metric types explicitly stated underground circuit miles and overhead circuit miles, because I know that there were some issues with that last year trying to figure out that information. So we've tried to just make it a little easier for everyone. And that was the intent with these changes here. And you could go to the next slide, please. And then table 8, location of utility equipment additions or removal. Again, it's the same theme kind of going throughout. A lot of these changes were just made to try to make things easier for everyone. As you can see in the topic, the example on the top there, a lot of these attributes were embedded in these fields and in the years, and we've removed those and just kind of made them their own standalone fields, just making it easier for people to go through these tables, and hopefully easier for people to populate them as they go through them. And then, and you can just go to the next field, or excuse me, the next slide. And then table 9. So table 9 is location of utility. It's the same theme again, just kind of going through, rather than make another graphic showing the old one. I just, just removing those old kind of attributes from those fields, and then making them their own standalone fields now. Just trying to make it easier for everyone to use this information, or fill it out and then use this information. You can go to the next slide. And then, so PSPS was, there was a lot of changes there, a lot of new stuff. And so I try to fit as much as I can in this table for everyone to review if they wanted to look at it. Again, we did make a change log, and I guess we'll kind of go over, when we would try to show that to other people. But right now, for now, this is what I created for stakeholders to review, where you can kind of compare the old fields to the new fields and see what's been modified and what hasn't. I think one of the bigger changes we've made is we added a wind warning status field, where I believe it was just metric type 1. So it doesn't apply, which does not apply to the other metric types. But that was one of the biggest changes, I think, in that table, with addition to the new metrics. You can go to the next slide. Table 11 was formerly I believe the old table 12, which was the financial data. Again, I put together this really quick snapshot of what was removed, what was modified. I guess the biggest thing you'll notice that's been removed is the estimated RSC, the different HFTD zones which were removed. And we also removed the line miles treated field with the territory and HFTD in the alternate units of use section. And now purely it's just going to be CapEx and OpEx territory in HFTD. And also, as opposed to kind of sticking with the old initiative numbering from before, we're going to really focus on using that initiative tracking ID within this table as well. You can go to the next slide. And table 12, a new table for this year that we were asked to create. Again, this is very similar to the QIU. Going to be utilizing that utility initiative tracking ID. And this graphic is just kind of meant to illustrate what the policy team was hoping to get out of this table, you know, for the end of quarter targets. Specifically, those are meant to capture the asset inspections, veg management inspections, and PS outreach and engagement initiatives. Whereas with the end of year targets, they want those types of initiatives as well as all the remaining initiative categories. And I believe they'll go into more detail about that in the next presentation. But that was the idea behind capturing this information in this table. And this is a little different from the QIU, whereas the QIU is just trying to capture, current year information, where this is looking out to 2025. You can go to the next slide. And then there's table 13, the open work orders and notifications, also new for 2023. I think these the headers here, the field names have a lot of, they're kind of self-explanatory. I know there's some questions surrounding these that we'll try to get to. And one of the issues that came up during the comments on this new data was the GO95 rule versus internal priority levels. So in order to address those concerns, we have added a field here that it would allow you to map those GO95 levels to your internal levels. But other than that, this is a brand new table, and again, the fields in this are all listed in the data guidelines. And go to the next slide, I think. And we'll start with questions. And with this section, Jenny Reed was going to kind of help me go through some of these questions as I was out when we got a lot of these. So I'll try to help where I can.
Yeah, this section had a lot of questions in the pre-workshop submission. So I'm going to try to run through them in some sort of semblance of organization. So first, there's a pretty big group of questions that kind of, I guess I'll say that one of the challenges with discussing the data guidelines is where those guidelines intersect with policy and compliance. And the data guidelines are trying to reflect out just the data collection aspects of what policy and compliance require. And so of course, sometimes we're going to run into situations where there are questions that are outside of the scope of our group. And so a lot of the questions actually kind of point towards stuff like that. And we are providing those to policy and compliance where it's needed and they're being discussed. And I guess I can just say that in any case where the data guidelines use a term taken, at least to our understanding, say taken from the WMP guidelines, we want to do our best to make sure that that those terms are defined and understood from wherever we got them from, because we don't make them up ourselves. So so questions that had to do with definitions of terms, I think there was one that was a question about like, what do we mean by early wildfire detection systems? What do we mean by upgrades? Like scope of work orders, use of the term wildfire. So some of these types of questions, they are on the radar, we hear you, and we are circling back with policy and compliance to make sure that that's documented somewhere so that you you know, you guys can have the answers to that. There are also, one of the other kind of groupings was about table 13, which is a new table, and that feedback is also being provided to policy. I don't know if policy wants to speak to anything on table 13 in the workshop, that's fine. But if not, you know, then we're taking that information and we aggregated it to provide back. So your guys' comments are being considered and being heard. So from there, and also, you know, any of what I've just said, or if you're thinking like, oh, well, I had this question and it was about a definition, but when I'm done going through all this stuff, you guys can raise your hand and, you know, clarify, ask more. Just because I'm saying like, oh, that's policy, they have to talk about that, doesn't mean that you can't bring it up here, and we'll note it down. So next I'll go to some of the errors. We had some errors flagged. Let me grab those. So, okay, we had a typo identified in table 5, that will be corrected. We had another a change flag that there was a reversion to an annual metric in table 5, but the guidelines reference the year and quarter, and so we're confirming that. Thank you for flagging that, and it will be corrected. The template is correct. It's only to be years. And then I think, Aaron, you just put in, you found an error just now and let us know in the chat or in the Q&A, a typo. So that's noted too, and we have that down and we will correct that. There was also a, I think there were 2 questions about calculation, unit definition and calculation for RFW circuit mile days, and I think FPI also, Noe, right? And those, I think, Noe, you mentioned it on your slide, but also the instructions for unit calculation are contained in column AI of the table, of table 4. So it just looks like maybe the questioner didn't see where that guidance was provided, and I think the reason it's there is just because that's where it was historically, and it's not a new calculation, and so we just didn't move it because we figured that's where people were used to seeing it. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that was my understanding. Okay, so those are the corrections that we flagged, or specific things that we flagged. I will move on now to, there were a couple questions where I was hoping to actually get clarification. So I don't know if everyone's on the call in these cases, but let me pull up these questions. Okay, so PG&E submitted a question for table 6, ignition driver, splice clamp connection, that's all in quotes. What is the intent in combining these 3 items? We are concerned that combining the items makes the data more difficult to understand. If anyone is on the call, if anyone's on the call who can speak to that, can you please clarify where you're seeing this? We see in table 6 that splice and connection device are separate, and in was it spatial data, but you know, that's also a little bit different. So just trying to clarify where that was seen.
If you want to clarify this question, please raise your hand and I will unmute you. Go ahead, Nelson.
All right, Nelson from PG&E. It's more of a, it's a reverse question actually. So we have those three categorized together. We have the group together, and we're just trying to see if is it mandatory for us to split the data into those two buckets?
Oh, okay. Let's see. I will. I mean, I guess my short answer is just that the way we have it defined now directly comes from, our users, which are policy and compliance. So that's where it comes from. And I will take your question and put it out there. But I think the way that we have it now is the intention for how it should be reported. And okay, I'm just noting down, sorry. Okay. And
We do have another question from Landy.
okay.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, so two questions since you're touching all of these tables. One is regarding the FPI's newly added metric for table 4. So FPI, the way we as SDG&E classify FPI score is at the 3 level. We have normal and elevated and extreme. So what would be considered as a high FPI? So FPI is kind of different from the other two, the high warning, red flag warning. It's not like we either have one or we don't have one. We track FPI score every day. So we would like a little bit of clarification on what type of, what level would be considered as reportable in this particular metric table. And then the other question is regarding, you mentioned that in table 5 risk event report, we don't have to report quarterly data anymore. Does that mean we just need to update those count by drivers once a year? And then we only need to update the quarterly data in table 2. That's my 2 questions.
Yeah, I think with regards to the FPI question, we'll have to kind of take that one into consideration, or unless someone on policy wants to chime in on that.
No way. This is Colin from policy. I'm happy to try to take that.
Thank you, Colin.
Landy, currently the way we have asked for high FPI in quotes is for the utility to define it for themselves, what that high is. I think from those 2 levels, like normal wouldn't be considered high. It'd probably be one of the other 2, but we would leave it up to SDG&E to define what it considers high.
Okay, sounds good.
And then with the second question in regards to reporting yearly versus quarterly, we did see that one. Again, I mean, I guess I'll leave that question to policy if they want to chime in on that. I mean, we certainly can. Again, we're just kind of facilitating the receiving of this data. So if there's someone who wanted to chime in and provide more detail, or otherwise, we definitely read that question and we're considering it.
No, it was this
This is the one where in tables, I believe it's.
Was there another
Five.
question though? Was there a second? I'm trying to remember because we were talking about. I think there's a related question from another organization. So let me hold on. Let me see if this is it. Maybe it was a different table. There was a question about annual versus quarterly. Do you remember?
Yeah, I think
Maybe.
I know what you're talking about. So
But was it not
that
on
one-
table 5?
I think it grouped them all together, like table 5, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9, I think.
Yeah.
Where some of those were reported quarterly previously, and now they're just yearly. And the question was whether or not when they report, when they submit their Q1 data, did they want to have, the Q1 actuals mixed in with the projections?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
if that is to be updated with every submission.
Let me, here.
Do you need a clarification from me for the question?
No, I think I just wanted to try to pull in because you asked about the the change from quarterly to
Right.
annual, and there was another question that also asked about changes from quarterly to
Right.
annual.
I think it's SDG as well. We listed that question as well. If you confirm the template, table 5 template is the correct version, so that means the only quarterly updates on risk events are only in table 2.
Yeah. Well, I can't find it, but maybe I'll find it. There was another one. It had to do with like how it affects.
Tammy, I think it's in the chat, Jordan,
Let me see.
in the Q&A. Referring to the question I talked about tables 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
Yeah. So I think this is kind of related because it was a change on annual, and basically in the discussion, Noe and I kind of realized like we remembered back that some of this change was about like, at least what we were remembering from the meetings was like, does annual projections at the quarterly level really make sense? Like, to ask for projections by quarter. And then that change to annual got carried through to the actuals in some cases. And so the question was for us to go back to policy and say, hey, do we want the actuals to remain at the quarter level while the projections can be annual for certain things that, maybe that granularity can be retained about how things actually played out versus the projections don't necessarily need to be at the quarter. So that's something that we have noted due to questions that came in to go back and ask policy and compliance. And that the answer to that would affect the answer, Jordan, to this question about like kind of handling, what does a projection mean if you already know that something happened in Q1? How does that, affect your projections? I think it would just be based on, I think what Colin what Lucy mentioned way earlier in our workshop. It sounds like it would just be one projection for the year, and then you would report out what happens. If you guys are revising your projections, that's something that I think policy would probably have to clarify about what the expectation is for projections refinement through the year.
Jenny, this is Colin. As far as I know, your statement is correct. Policy uses the annual projections in its WMP evaluation. And so the idea of like updating those projections quarterly doesn't make a whole lot of sense because the WMP is very much a snapshot in time. But yes, we would want those like quarterly actuals as they come in.
Okay. Yeah, so we'll circle back and make sure that that kind of philosophy is, we'll double check on the tables and see, annual projections, quarterly actuals, and just make sure that plays out across the tables, the many, many tables. Thank you, Colin. I am seeing another question in the Q&A from Amy. Can you confirm we only need to provide distribution data for table 13?
Yeah, that one, I think we're going to need some help on policy for that.
That's the work order table, right?
Yeah, yep.
That might be like a technical thing about work orders. So I don't know if anyone's on the call who can take that.
Yeah, I can answer that. The intent for table 13 was to be all asset data, so distribution and transmission, but there was a comment from Cal Advocates about potentially scaling down that information that we're still looking at and reviewing. So don't have a solid answer currently.
Thanks, Andy.
Thank you, Andy. There was still an open question here.
From Lena.
From Lena, what is the purpose of reporting targets and actuals in both table 1 and table 12? Any consideration in consolidating those tables as they are very duplicative, excuse me.
I can answer this because this was already planned for like one of the
Sure.
kind of high level. We got a lot of questions ahead of the workshop about this issue, about you know, table 1 and table 12 overlaps. So we'll just kind of clarify that like the high level purpose of the tables, where, and of course this is our understanding. Call in or policy jump in as needed if I misspeak. But table 12, it's my understanding that it was developed with the intention to capture specifically those initiatives that are flagged for mid-year and end of year targeting, as opposed to, you know, just annual projections. And it asks for specific information about, you know, those specific initiatives. And it asks for that information over the course of the whole WMP life cycle, the 3-year cycle. And then table 1 is intended to capture all initiatives in their current year, like snapshot status of like what's happening through the year, projected actuals this year. All initiatives on that with that perspective, kind of what's going on in this year. So we acknowledge that there are these two intentions and they were implemented and there are overlaps. And the comments about the overlaps are being considered for sure. And more discussions do need to take place. I think there's a lot, I think all of us acknowledge that there's a lot of room for improvement in how, you know, how we can meet the needs for those two different looks into the initiative data. And those conversations are ongoing and are happening. That's the answer that I have right now. And if there are other specific questions about it, feel free to raise your hand, or if you have other comments that you want us to note to contribute to that discussion, then go ahead and type them in or raise your hand and we'll get them down. I'm going to look again at what we've covered already in the submissions. Here. Let's see. I think there was a couple that, oh yeah, okay. So one of the questions that we got, I think this was a Cal Advocates question, so maybe you guys can clarify. It was saying that annual financial data, spending and forecast spending talking about, it's the question said each quarter we should know how much is spent on each initiative reported out in table 1 and table 12. Are you saying that that's what you expect to see, or are you saying that based on tables 1 through 12 we already have that information? I just wanted some clarification about annual financial spending and forecast spending. Is this table meant to be filled out only at the beginning of the year, or should it be completed every quarter? Recommend this data to be submitted only once per year. Each quarter, we should know how much is spent on each initiative reported out in table 1 and 12. Table 1 and 12 don't include spend, I don't believe. So I'm trying to, if you can just jump in at any point. We're trying to look at this, but if you have anything to add, we would appreciate it.
If you have something to add, please raise your hand and I will allow you to speak.
And if not, that's okay.
Hi, sorry, I'm just trying to get unmuted. It's Ian Fisher.
Okay.
Apologies. First of
No
all,
worries.
I'm trying to read my own question and then I'm just trying to get unmuted. So the multitasking is killing me.
No, okay.
Apologies there, Ian. I hit the wrong button.
Oh no,
Oh, there we go again. How's that? Can you
you're
hear me?
back. Yep.
I am back. So was it question 4 you're asking? Our question 4.
Oh my gosh. I think I dropped the number.
What sort of metrics does OES anticipate the utilities using to demonstrate progress towards targets?
No, this is about table 11,
Oh, okay, right.
the
sorry.
financials table.
One moment.
Yep.
So ignore the last bullet point, basically. And
Okay.
how are these things being reported out? Are we expecting the data financials to be reported once a year and then in relationship the quarters in relationship to that, or are you expecting actually update and change of targets every quarter?
Okay, so okay, I think I'm hearing you that because the table only asks for the information for the year, but the submission timeline has it submitted every quarter, is it Energy Safety's expectation that those numbers are going to change from quarter to quarter within a given year?
Yes.
That's okay. So if that's outside my scope, I don't know. We have more data points that are kind of annual. Right now, we only have one submission cadence, and there it has come up as a question, you know, should we pull apart an annual submission cadence, what falls under that and what falls under quarterly? And so that is something that I think this might, depending on the answer to that question, you know, it's related to that larger question of, you know, if we're asking for some information quarterly at the quarterly level and we're asking for some information at the year level, are there any examples where the year stuff should just only be submitted every year, where if, you know, not only is it not expected to change, but maybe it's not supposed to change, right? So I can't say what policy expects, you know, if those financials are expected to be kind of fluid and changing. But I see your question and you know, and it's noted.
Okay, so I guess the only response to that is in the next data guidelines, if it could clarify whether it's to be submitted once a year or whether it's to be modified every quarter, and what it actually that would be useful.
Well, I can say that right now, all of the data submissions are quarterly. So like in the submission timeline, like in the submission guidance, all tables will be submitted every quarter. That's how it's designed right now. So any kind of, if there was anything that should only be submitted annually, the question would just be, would you submit the same thing over and over again? Like basically you just wouldn't touch that table, even though it would come in. And trust me, like I'm not a fan of redundant data submissions. So that's something that, you know, we would like to see, you know, improved, but it's something we just manage right now. But I want to be clear that like right now, the submission guidance that's in the document stands. So all of the tables would be submitted every quarter.
But what are your expectations for
It's
that
not my-
table to be just to be a constant value each quarter, or to? I mean, I think that's what needs clarifying.
Yeah,
whether it
and
actually needs updating or not.
I think.
yeah, and
I think-
that's go ahead, Stephen.
Yes, the tables are submitted quarterly. I think a larger question here is what of the values within the tables get updated quarterly versus annually. And I think that's, again, something we need to take for internal conversations to make sure we have it all hammered out. And then that's something we should be able to include in the guidelines to better specify what is the expectation around what data gets updated on a quarterly basis versus what's updated on an annual basis. But to be clear, the tables are still submitted quarterly. The question is, what is of the data do we expect to see quarterly values updated versus that value may be reported in, say, just example Q1, and that's an annual update, and it just gets that same value gets reported out in Q2, 3, 4, and it gets updated again. Q1 of next year. That's what we need to have internal conversations on to really hammer out what the expectations are.
And I would say that if the answer to what you're asking is not in the WMP guidelines, then, you know, it's not defined right now then. Because it's not, you know, it's not our data team expectation. And so, you know, what is supposed to happen from quarter to quarter with any given, you know, data point. If that's not in the WMP guidelines, then it's not defined, and you know, we'll continue with internal discussions on that. And thank you for bringing it up.
Okay, thank you.
And then let's see. We're kind of, I guess we still have time. Do we have any? Is there anything flagged for questions? I'm kind of being mindful of like bumping up against other.
If we don't have any, I'd say if we don't have any other raised hands or Q&A, we feel we've kind of covered most of the questions we've gotten. And I think we can probably move on to the next section. So I guess maybe do the last call for questions in this area. If there are no other questions or raised hands, then I think Joan will be next.
Yeah, because I know we had a lot more submitted questions, but we're like mindful of time. I think we'll cut it off and just say we've got everything that you guys submitted.
Joan, if you're ready, you're up.
I am ready. I'm trying to turn my camera on, but it's saying I don't have the control to turn it on.
Try again, Joan.
How's that? Oh, there I am. Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I am Joan Weber. I work for the Policy Division. I'm an engineer, and I'm going to be going over the 2023 performance metrics. New ones being added, some being amended, and a couple being removed. Next slide, please. So to go over what we're going to talk about, I'm going to give you a little background on why these new performance metrics are happening this next year. I'm also going to talk a little bit about the connection between the performance metrics and our WMP process. I will cover a little bit on the stakeholder comments that we've received so far on these new metrics. And then we'll go through the actual retained ones, the new ones, the amended ones, and the removed metrics for 2023. And then we will discuss the next steps. Next steps, please. Thank you. For the background, Energy Safety is required to consult with the CPUC on performance metrics for electrical corporations pursuant to Public Utilities Code Section 8389 D1. Also, the draft metrics for 2023 were published in the CPUC's resolution recently. It was labeled SPD-3 on 9/16. Stakeholders submitted comments to that resolution on 10/10 of this year. We reviewed all of the comments that came in and we incorporated the comments provided where appropriate. Next slide. Performance metrics and WMPs. This is a little bit of history here. The current performance metrics were adopted by the 2021 WMPs by the CPUC in 2020 and can be found in Table 2 and Attachment 2.3 of Resolution WSD-11. The CPUC issued Resolution M-4860 in December of 2021, continuing the 2022 performance metrics used to evaluate the 2021 WMPs. Currently, Energy Safety drafted performance metrics in Resolution SPD-3. They reflect new amended performance metrics that will be used for the 2023 WMP evaluations and compliance reviews. Overview of the comments we received. So we received comments from 4 stakeholders. They consisted of the 3 large electrical corporations and then 1 organized group that represented the small and the multi-jurisdictional utilities. The nature of these comments range from raising technical points to requesting clarifications and raising matters that were unique to the smaller electrical corporations. Comments, there were 3 big ones that pretty much all of the utilities commented on. These were the performance metric 1E, performance metric 6, and performance metric 9. These were the new ones that we had proposed for this next year. 1E was relating to outages related to fast trip settings. Comments received were requesting clarification on specific wording for this metric. We have clarified the description for the metric. For performance metric 6, it was pretty much all of the utilities. Oh, and just a description on this one, it was a circuit mile days operated above rate current carrying capacity. We received from all the utilities that they felt that this, for various reasons, that this metric should be removed. And we agreed with everyone and we removed it. So that one is gone. Then we had performance metric number 9, which originally was looking at the time between a utility detecting an ignition and the utility notifying the public safety partners. We have changed this up to a similar type metric. I'll talk about it a little more later, but now we're going to be looking at the time that the utility has been basically alerted that there is a problem on the circuit and when they roll a truck to go investigate what has happened in that event. Retain metrics for 2023. So we're going to retain 1 A through D, which has to do with the risk events and probability of the ignition. We're going to retain 10 A and B. That has to do with fatalities and injuries due to utility-related ignitions. We are also going to retain 11 AB, the value of assets destroyed by utility-ignited fires. We are also going to retain 12 A and B, structures damaged or destroyed by utility-related ignitions. We're also going to retain 13A, acreage burn by utility United wildfires. And we're going to retain 14 A and B, number of utility related ignitions, and 18 the metrics for community outreach. New metrics for 2023. The new metrics provide measuring, which includes coincident or resulting from wildfire, consequences resulting from wildfire, and from the WMP implementation. Sorry about that, guys. The utilities response times from inspection findings to risk reducing activities related to vegetation and asset management. We also are looking at the response times to events and grid conditions findings and fixes. New metrics for 2023 are 1E, number of outages on circuits where fast trip is enabled. 2, time between vegetation inspection findings and resulting trimming activities. 3 through 5, time between level 1, 2, and 3 asset inspection finding and resulting maintenance activity. Number 7 is going to be number of open and past due vegetation management work orders. Number 8 is number of asset management open and past due work orders. Number 9 is the time from detecting an event and dispatching personnel to investigate. And number 16 is grid condition fixes in response to inspection findings. Amended metrics for 2023. We have 2 of them. The first one is number 15. This is the grid condition findings from inspections, including the number of assets, structures, and circuit miles. This metric has been broken down by inspection type now and technology used during the inspection. This is something that Energy Safety has been asking through data request processes for a couple of years now. So we just decided we should just go ahead and make this a metric. The metric will be used to quantify trends in the number of inspection findings, and we'll use that to look at the ratio of fixes to findings. The second amended metric for 2023 is number 17. This is the one for vegetation clearance findings from inspection. It's the number of trees inspected for vegetation and compliance, where at least some vegetation has been found to be non-compliant. So in this one, the change up here is that the emphasis is from routine versus non-routine inspections and is further broken down by inspection methodology. Previously, this was based on span length inspections, and now it's modified to look at the number of trees in an alignment. The metric will be used to quantify trends in the number of vegetation inspection findings and asset potential impact for wildfire safety. Remove metrics for 2023. Energy Safety has removed 2 metrics. They're metric 8 and 9. Metric 8 was the one that was for fatalities resulting from utility wildfire mitigation initiatives. Number 9 is the Cal OSHA reportable injuries from utility wildfire mitigation initiatives. We found that other entities are tracking these metrics and are required, the utilities are required to report on these to those other entities. So we're pulling it out. We're pulling them both out of our request for metrics. Next steps. So the Energy Safety has updated the 2023 performance metrics and sent those to the CPUC. The CPUC has updated resolution SPD-3, which is now revision 1. That is actually being voted on today by the commissioners for adoption. So after that happens today, then the new metrics will be, and the amended ones will be rolled into the data guidelines. And that'll be reflected in the final performance metrics. And just to add to this, the expectation on these new and amended metrics is that there is, as other metrics, quarterly reporting. So this starts at the beginning of 2023. So we expect to see all of this new data coming in May of 2023. And any questions?
All right, we have Daniel Butler from SDG&E.
Hello.
Hi, Daniel.
Hello. Can you hear me now?
Yep, can hear you.
Okay.
Thanks.
Yes. Okay. I was just wondering if you could provide a little bit more clarification for that new metric that was added regarding the time between identifying an event and then a response time.
Sure. So, and you'll see that there's, more of a description when you see this new one pop up. This would be, for instance, your SCADA system detects a locked out circuit breaker. And that would be, that would basically be an indication that some kind of major event happened on a circuit. So we're looking at that event notification coming in. How much time does it take you guys to roll a truck to go out to investigate why that circuit breaker was locked open? Does that help?
Yes, it does. I think there's probably going to be a lot of discussion around that because it does tie in our union represented personnel. So I think we'll have to have some more discussions about that metric.
We look forward to those discussions. Any other questions? Okay. Brian, Stephen, do you want to open it up for questions for the whole workshop?
Sure. If there are any questions others have that we have not addressed, we do have time to answer any questions. So feel free to either type in the Q&A or raise your hand.
All right, we have a question from Chris Parks.
Go ahead, Chris. Is Chris unmuted?
He is unmuted, but no sound is coming through.
Chris, weren't able to hear you. If you can try putting your question in the Q&A if we don't hear any audio from you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I apologize. Trying to navigate my laptop here. I apologize. If I could go back to, the slide about removed metrics for 2023 for a moment. And I wanted to ask, it said, I think, these metrics are health and safety issues that are covered by other state or federal authorities. I think there are metrics that get reported or they can be requested by other authorities. And I'm not exactly sure if there's an easy way to access that information. Is there a problem with just kind of having these metrics all listed together with the other safety metrics? Is that a problem?
I wouldn't say it's a problem, Chris, but if we have some utility representatives still on the call, it'd be great to hear if you guys have any information on how you're required to report this information and how accessible this information is when you report it.
If you'd like to comment on that, please raise your hand.
Chris, if we don't have anyone that can provide this information today, I can definitely look into this for you and get back to you on this.
Absolutely, thank you. And would you mind going to the next slide just for a moment?
Sure. Did you mean this one?
That's fine. I don't have any additional questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris.
All right. If there are any other questions, please type in the Q&A or raise your hand. Well, I'm not seeing any hands raised or any Q&As yet. So if there's nothing else from anybody, again, thank you all again for taking time out of your day. I hope this workshop has been informational and been helpful for you all. And hopefully we've been able to address a lot of the questions that are answered. Again, for regards to the draft data guidelines, we still have the comment period ends on the 27th of this month. So we still have time to comment on the guidelines if you wish and submit that to us. Other than that, again, just thank you all. Have a good day and stay safe.